If you drive a front-wheel drive car, the differential is nothing you should worry about as it's constantly soaked with transmission oil and virtually never fails. Even in rear-wheel drive or four-wheel drive vehicles, differential failure is pretty rare, but it definitely happens. And when it does happen, rest assured that you will notice it. The main symptoms of a bad differential are all kinds of noises coming from the back of the vehicle: whirring, grinding, rumbling, clunking, and whining. The noise can appear when turning, driving straight, and when accelerating, decelerating. Depending on the type of noise, we can isolate which part of the differential has failed. What are the 6 symptoms of a bad differential? 1. Whirring when slowing down. A constant whirring noise, which can also be described as humming, is pretty much always caused by a bad pinion gear bearing. The pinion gear directly attaches to the drive shaft, and it's what turns all the differential gears and the wheels. The pinion gear bearing also needs some preload, since it's not pressed into the differential case, so there is a chance that it's just loose. But if it is loose, that increases the chances of damage significantly, so it's best to replace it if you hear this noise. Unfortunately, to replace the pinion-bearing gear, you need to disassemble the entire differential because the bearing is pressed onto the input shaft. You will also need a hydraulic press, so this isn't a job for the average DIY-er. It's also a good idea to get the bearing replaced as soon as you can to avoid destroying the pinion and ring gears, which will be a lot more expensive to replace. 2. Whining or buzzing when accelerating. A whining or buzzing noise when accelerating is in most cases caused by bad ring gear, pinion gear, or both. The pinion gear attaches to the drive shaft, and the ring gear attaches and moves the spider gears or the differential itself. Replacing these alone takes a ton of time, and at that point, you're better off buying a used or a rebuilt differential. If you hear this type of noise, there's also a chance that the pinion and ring gears don't line up properly. But that happens only if you or one of the previous owners has modified the differential. Installing a different ring gear is what changes the final drive ratio, and it's an extremely popular mod on rear-wheel drive cars. 3. Whirring or grinding that subsides in the bends. If you hear a constant whirring or grinding noise that disappears or becomes quieter when driving through corners, it's usually a sign of a bad carrier bearing. Keep in mind that these noises are fairly quiet to begin with, so you want to pay special attention to it to see if this is what's happening. The carrier bearing sits pretty much in the middle of the differential or inside the ring gear, to be more precise. Replacing this bearing pretty much calls for a full differential rebuild, as do all other differential bearings. It's worth mentioning that the carrier bearing has adjustment shims and sometimes a threaded adjuster ring that needs to be set up just right. If your differential had been rebuilt recently, there is a chance the bearing wasn't adjusted properly. 4. Recurrent clunking while driving at a steady pace. A constant clunking noise whose frequency increases with speed is a clear sign that the ring gear or pinion gear is missing some teeth. The clunking is present when driving at a steady pace, when accelerating, and when decelerating. As for parts, it all depends on what you are replacing. If you only replace one bearing, they usually cost around $20. But since you are already paying hundreds for labor, you might as well replace all the bearings and seals. A standard differential rebuild kit with all the bearings, shims, and gaskets costs between $80 and $150. It can also cost way more, but that's for limited slip differentials and heavy-duty trucks. The average cost then, with parts and labor, comes to $400. How much does it cost to replace the differential? Replacing a differential is something you should consider only if one of the gears is damaged or broken. Otherwise, a differential rebuild makes much more sense. When replacing a differential, you have a few options. You can buy a new one, a used one, or a remanufactured one. A brand new differential will set you back anywhere between $800. Replacing the spider gear alone is possible, but again, it makes a lot more sense to replace the whole differential. That's especially true since missing teeth on the spider gear can damage other gears and even the differential case. There is also a chance that the differential jams and locks up your rear wheels mid-corner, which will 100% end in a serious accident. 6. A single clunk when pressing the gas or brake pedal. If you hear a single clunk when you first start moving or when you first press the brake pedal, it's a sign that something is loose. In some cases, the entire differential can be loose and moving around. This happens when the differential mounting bushings are worn out, when the car's floor is rusted, or when the bolts are not tightened properly. This can also be a sign of loose yokes. That can be the drive shaft or half shaft yoke. The yoke is a flange where the half shaft or drive shaft attaches to the differential. These usually wear out over time and start clunking. The yokes alone can be replaced without touching anything else, but the differential still has to be removed and disassembled. And since labor will be by far the highest cost, you might as well replace all the bearings. Front differential symptoms. A front differential is something you will find in front-wheel drive and four-wheel drive cars. In front-wheel drive cars, the differential is integrated into the transmission. That means it's constantly soaked with transmission oil and it virtually never fails. Even if you drain all the oil, the transmission gears will go out first, and the differential will be left with virtually no damage. As for four-wheel drive cars, the front differential is pretty much the same as the rear one. The external design is a little different and more compact, but the internal gears and yokes are almost identical. That means the symptoms of a front differential are the same as those of a rear differential. The only difference is that all the noises we described will be coming from the front of the vehicle instead of the rear. When to rebuild a differential and how much does it cost? Rebuilding a differential only makes sense if one or more of the bearings are worn out, or if one of the yokes is damaged. A standard rear differential rebuild takes about 3 to 4 hours with the differential already removed. If the differential is still on the vehicle, add another hour to the rebuild. That's about $200 to $400 in labor. As for parts, it all depends on what you are replacing. If you only replace one bearing, they usually cost around $20. But since you are already paying hundreds for labor, you might as well replace all the bearings and seals. A standard differential rebuild kit with all the bearings, shims, and gaskets costs between $80 and $150. It can also cost way more, but that's for limited slip differentials and heavy-duty trucks. The average cost then, with parts and labor, comes to $400. How much does it cost to replace the differential? Replacing a differential is something you should consider only if one of the gears is damaged or broken. Otherwise, a differential rebuild makes much more sense. When replacing a differential, you have a few options. You can buy a new one, a used one, or a remanufactured one. A brand new differential will set you back anywhere between $800 and $1,500, and that's for a standard car. If you drive a truck or a car with a solid rear axle, a new differential will cost thousands. A used differential is significantly cheaper, but also very risky unless you buy it from a trusted seller. A used one will cost anywhere between $150 and $500 depending on the condition. But the best option of the three is buying a remanufactured differential. These cost between $400 and $800 for a standard differential and $1,000 to $1,500 for a solid axle. You also usually get a 1-year warranty, which isn't something you can expect from a used differential and sometimes even a new one. As for labor costs, expect to pay around $100 to $300 depending on the type of differential. You can also replace the differential yourself and save some money on labor, especially if it's a vehicle with a live rear axle. What causes differential failure? Differential failure in most cases is caused by normal wear and tear. Failing to change the differential fluid at manufacturer-specified intervals will speed up the wear of all the bearings and gears. Factory defects can also cause differential failure, but so can bad driving habits. Dumping the clutch, for example, puts a lot of strain on the differential and can break the gear teeth. How often should you change the differential fluid? How often you should change differential fluid depends on the vehicle. You can find the right intervals in your owner's manual or contact the dealer. In most cases, it's at 30,000 if you drive a big four-wheel drive truck or SUV, and every 60,000 miles if you drive a rear-wheel drive saloon. How long do differentials last? Even without changing the differential fluid regularly, differentials usually outlast the vehicle. Differentials don't have a replacement schedule, and the more miles the car has, the higher the chances of differential failure. If the differential fails before it reaches 150,000 miles, you can consider that a premature failure. But it is much more common that it lasts well over 200,000 miles. To summarize what we talked about in this video, the symptoms of a bad differential are just noises happening at different times and different conditions. Those include whirring, grinding, clunking, and whining. These can happen all the time, only when accelerating, only when decelerating, only when turning, or they stop when turning. Each noise and the conditions at which they occur indicate different problems with the differential, which we already covered. and the symptoms of a front differential are pretty much identical, with the only difference being that the noise comes from the front of the vehicle instead of the rear. I hope this video helped. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like and follow so you don't miss any of my videos.